As we open up to 1 Samuel chapter 21, some of you may remember back in the spring of 2017, we were doing small groups on Sunday night. We did a small group, and we took this marriage conference by a guy named Mark Gungor. We split it up into, I don't remember if it was 4 to 6 segments, however long it took. We split it up, and we kind of met together. I think it was one of the largest attended small groups, at least we had there in my tenure. And we sat there, and we took it in. We laughed together. The name of that by Mark Gungor was Laughing Your Way to a Better Marriage, and we laughed a lot through that process. But in that, there was a part where he talked about different personalities of people. And as we often do, we oversimplify things. Life is not this simple. But sometimes psychologists group us into different types of personalities. And Mark Gungor shared one of those views that there's 4 types of people. There are the control people that always feel like they need to be in control. There's the fun people that just want to have a blast. There's the perfect people that want everything to be just so. And then there are the peace people that just want everyone to get along. And he talked about how usually you do not marry somebody that is like you. Whichever little world you live in, you're married to someone else. And so, being the nerd that I am, I took the little test to find out what I was. And I took the little test, and I took the test, and it said that I fell into the perfect category. Now, hear me out. It doesn't mean I'm perfect, and I don't think I'm perfect. Some of you are already giggling. It doesn't mean that we think we're perfect. Here's what it means. We love to live in a world where everything is just so, and everything is just right, and everybody follows the rules, right? And some of you say, well, that's such a bum. You want to live in a fun world. Well, as Mark Gungor said, there's a place for these people. You really want your architects and your builders and the people that design and build your planes to be perfect people, right? You don't want fun people to build planes because that may not go well because they just care if it gets off the ground. If it blows up, who cares? You'll build another one. You want the people that want everything to be just so. And I live in that mind frame, and many of you know that already, and it drives you nuts, and it drives my family nuts, and it drives me nuts sometimes. And I say all that to say this. This is a sermon that if I were sitting where you are, I wouldn't like it. Do you see the name of this? When it's okay to break a rule, all right? When it's okay to break a rule. Now, you're going to see in your bulletin, and I should have put it up there, the break is going to be in quotation marks, but when it's okay to break a rule, we're going to look in 1 Samuel chapter 21 where we're going to see David go to a priest and there's a rule broken. And there's some of us that in our heart of hearts say, this is odd and it makes me uncomfortable. And even as I shared, it makes me uncomfortable. And before we even go too far, some of you may be thinking, so if it makes him uncomfortable, why does he go there? Why don't you preach something that makes you uncomfortable? And this is what I would remind you. That type of logic, those type of questions is a very dangerous thing. We don't preach and teach the things that make us comfortable. We preach the scriptures. And it is what it is, and it says what it says. And when it makes us uncomfortable, that is healthy. That is good. Those are the things that mold us and shape us into what God desires us to be. If you only teach and preach and read the things that make you comfortable, that's a dangerous, dangerous form of Christianity that may not just be Christianity at all. We're called to preach the text as it is and what it says. And even in my heart of hearts, we come across things that make us a tad bit uncomfortable. So let's jump into this breaking a rule. And before I said that aside, let me say this aside. And I'm speaking directly to children and teenagers. All right? We're not going to walk out of here and get in our cars and say that the preacher said that I can break every rule my parents said and it's okay. That is not what I'm saying, all right? So to the kids, I'm not giving you permission to break all your parents' rules. Hang with me. You'll understand where we're going. 1 Samuel chapter 21, beginning in verse 1. David, we saw 2 weeks ago as there's that last moment, or one of the last few moments with Jonathan and they're friends, but there's now distance. David now fleeing for his life. David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech came trembling to meet David, and he said to him, why are you alone and no one with you? And David said to Ahimelech the priest, the king, has commissioned me with a matter, and has said to me, let no one know anything about the matter on which I'm sending you, and with which I have commissioned you, and I have directed the young men to a certain place. Now therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever can be found. And the priest answered David and said, there's no ordinary bread on hand, but there's consecrated bread, if only the young men have kept themselves from women. David answered the priest, and he said to him, surely women have been kept from us as previously, when I set out, and the vessels of the young men were holy, though it was an ordinary journey. How much more then today will their vessels be holy? And so the priest gave him consecrated bread, for there was no bread there, but the bread of the presence, which was removed from the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place when it was taken. Now one of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's shepherds. And David said to Ahimelech, now is there not a spear or a sword on hand? For I brought neither sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's matter was urgent. And the priest said, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, who you killed in the valley of Elah, behold, is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you would take it for yourself, take it, for there's no other except it here. And David said, there's none like it. Give it to me. David comes to the priest. He says, I'm on a mission, and I'm hungry, and I need you to give me some bread. My other soldiers, they're in a place that's been appointed. We're going to meet up there in the certain place, but I need bread. Give me 5 loaves. And Ahimelech has a problem. The only bread on hand is the consecrated bread on the table of presence, and there are rules about these things. And the rule is, in the law, that only the Levites can eat of the bread on the table of presence. And there's rules in which they can eat that bread. And Ahimelech, which is shocking if you don't stop to ponder that aspect, David's not a Levite. But Ahimelech says, okay, and he actually shrinks down a few of the stipulations, and he says, okay, to eat this bread, you obviously need to be a priest, but you also need to be ceremonially clean. He understands that David's a soldier. There's potential he's been in battle. There's potential that he's been in warfare, and he's touched someone that may have been dead, and so that would have made him ceremonially unclean. And so Ahimelech narrows it down and says, you need to be ceremonially clean in regards to women. David says, we have been ceremonially clean because we're going off to war, and Ahimelech gives him the bread. And that is against the rule. And in my heart of hearts, that makes me very uncomfortable. Why can Ahimelech do this? And at first glance, you may say, well, that's not a big deal. Maybe we move on. But Jesus actually references this, which we're going to see in a moment. And Jesus makes a big deal about this in a positive way. And one of the interesting things, for time's sake, I won't read all through it, but if you go all the way back to Leviticus chapter 10, you come into this situation where Moses gives all of these instructions for a specific sacrifice. He gives them to Aaron. He says, this is the way this sacrifice has to be done. It plays out just a few verses later, and Aaron doesn't do it exactly as Moses says. Moses gets very, very mad, and Aaron explains why he did it the way he did it. Aaron says, I did it a little bit differently. You can read it in Leviticus chapter 12. And at the heart of it, Moses says, well, okay, then that's okay. And there's this principle that is beginning to form that the law is created and established as God's standard of holiness, God's standard of righteousness. This is what his people are to follow. To realize that when they fall short, they realize they need a mediator who can save them, which is what Jesus does. But here are the rules. But in Leviticus chapter 12 and in 1 Samuel chapter 21, we also see the heart of the law. That there are a few moments in time that come along when there is a greater good that is served by, quote unquote, breaking the rule, but you're not really breaking the rule, you're fulfilling the heart of the law. Now that may sound a little off. What do you mean by that? You're quote unquote breaking the rule, but you're fulfilling the heart of the law. So by setting that rule aside, you actually fulfill the intent of what God desired in the law, and you're not breaking the law. What does that mean? To understand what that means, we're going to look at Jesus. And this morning, what I'm going to share with you are 3 situations in which Jesus broke a rule. And we're going to start where he actually references what happened with David. Number 1, the rule was broken when someone was truly hungry. In Mark 22:23, we read that it happened that Jesus was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. The Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and his companions became hungry, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priest, and he gave it to those who are with him?" Jesus is referencing what we just read. And Jesus said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." In the context of Mark chapter 2, the Pharisees are really mad at Jesus. The reason the Pharisees were mad at Jesus is they quote Exodus chapter 34:21, which says, "You shall work 6 days, and on the 7th day you shall rest. Even during plowing time and harvest, you shall rest." The law says you can't harvest on the Sabbath. You can't harvest. You can't bring in the grain, store it up, work your servants, you work, and then you take it to market and you make a profit. And so they have all these rules in addition to the law, laying this out, and the Pharisees are really big on their rules. And the disciples are going out, they're really hungry. And Jesus says it's okay to pick the grain and just eat it. And the Pharisees say, "You can't do that. You're breaking the rule." And Jesus quotes about David. He says, "Don't you understand that someone is truly hungry, someone is really struggling, and you don't uphold, the point of the law is not to be simply a rule follower at the expense of hurting people. Don't you understand the intent of the law, that it is about people as we're going to see?" And we're not that much different from the Pharisees. I was reminded of these things this week in a tea group I was with that meets. We were there, and one of our deacons reminded me of a situation that occurred not long after I came here. Some of you may remember it in the previous sanctuary. I don't remember what Sunday it was. I couldn't tell you that, but I can tell you this. It was the last Sunday of the month, because on the last Sunday of the month, we have Brotherhood Breakfast. And just like every other Brotherhood breakfast at 7:30, we had great food, we had great fellowship, we had a great devotional. We enjoyed our time together as men. And not always, but what typically happens is whatever is left over, the men are cleaning up. They put it out on the counter. Back then we did Sunday school at 9, worship at 10. And so we did that. And so we went in there. And what could happen is as individuals and kids are coming to Sunday school, they could grab a bite to eat real quick and go to their class. On that Sunday, we did that like normal. But it just so happened there was a child that made a plate of scrambled eggs, along with maybe a few other things. They walked in the sanctuary that morning, and while Brother Kenny led worship and while I preached, that child ate scrambled eggs. Some of you remember that clear as day. That deacon shared in tea groups. In that tea group, I don't remember a thing. Kenny sang, I don't remember a thing Jim said, because all I could think about that entire service is I can't believe that we're sitting here and we're letting someone eat scrambled eggs in the sanctuary. Can you believe that? I was raised in a day and time you couldn't even chew gum in the sanctuary, and here we are at Thompson Baptist Church. There is someone eating scrambled eggs while the preacher is preaching. The person was very transparent, got all over him. And they walked out the door at the end of service. And that was kind of the chatter that someone there's a little kid ate scrambled eggs. And as they were talking about this afterwards, somebody walked up to that individual and said, you know, that might be the only meal that kid gets today. And it completely changed how that individual viewed that situation. Now, I'm not here to say that's the only meal that child got. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know the answer to all of those questions. But what that person confessed to in the moment is they had a mindset of what the rules are. And they missed that someone was hungry and they needed to be fed. You hear me? Now, here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying we should encourage all of our children to bring cinnamon rolls in here on Sunday morning. I'm not encouraging that at all, by the way. And I'm not saying if a child is hungry because you made them scrambled eggs and they really wanted grits and they were being really hard-headed and they didn't eat nothing but they could have and they're really hungry that you should give them a cinnamon roll. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that if we walked in here on Sunday morning and we saw a child who was truly hungry, and you took that child by the hand and you walked down to the fellowship hall and you missed 10 minutes of worship because you put food in that child's stomach so that you could walk back in, and then they might actually hear the word of God because they're not hungry, but their stomach is filled, and they hear the end of what the choir does, and then they hear the message of God. God might just be satisfied with that. But it's not our normal rules, you see. You get it? Jesus saw some people hungry, and he met the need at the expense of people that just saw rules. Secondly, we see there was a rule broken when someone was hurting. In Luke chapter 14, verse 1, it happened that when Jesus went into the house of one of the leaders of the Pharisees on the Sabbath to eat bread, they were watching him closely. And there in front of Jesus was a man suffering from dropsy. And Jesus answered and spoke to the lawyers and to the Pharisees. And he asked them about a rule. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? And they kept silent. He took hold of him, and he healed him, and he sent him away. And Jesus said to them, which one of you will have a son or an ox that falls into a well and will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath? And they could make no reply to this. Isn't it interesting that Jesus is invited into the home of a Pharisee, the rule followers? And they're sitting there, and it just so happens that right in front of Jesus while he's eating is a sick man on the Sabbath. Now dropsy would be, scholars tell us that this is a condition, the body was swelling, which means there would be pain and discomfort. There's swelling. The dropsy is a condition, it's a side effect of the real illness. It's the swelling. We don't know what's really wrong with him except he's swelling. It's evident to everybody. And he's sitting in front of Jesus. And so Jesus says, so can I help him? There's a man hurting in front of me. Can I help him on the Sabbath? But I understand we're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. And so can I help him? Or do I have to sit there and let the man suffer for the sake of the rule? And I'll just do it on the next day. And nobody said a word. And here's the deal. They didn't care about the man with dropsy. They're trying to find Jesus breaking a rule so they can get him in trouble and get rid of him. They don't care about the man. As a matter of fact, the man might have actually been a setup. And Jesus heals the man who is hurting. I think we would all agree that when we look at this, that the Lord's Day is unique and special, right? It's important. But Jesus asked, if your son fell in a well, your ox fell in a well, your ox falling in the well, if your means of livelihood fell in a well, wouldn't you do something about that? Like, if you're a truck driver and all your tires go flat and you gotta make a run early on Monday morning, wouldn't you do something about that? It's your means of livelihood. Sure you would. Jesus is acknowledging you would. It doesn't mean you're trying to get rich on the Lord's Day, but your livelihood is in danger. Wouldn't you do something about it? Jesus acknowledges that. And think of the Pharisees. they would not say helping the hurting man was more important than protecting their livelihood. They wouldn't say it. They wouldn't say the hurting man is more important than me making money tomorrow. And Jesus heals him anyway. And I wonder, do we have some rules in our lives that cause us to miss hurting people? Do you realize that whatever you think you're supposed to be doing on a day like today, part of what you're supposed to be doing on a day like today is helping hurting people? Jesus demonstrated that. But to help hurting people, you have to see hurting people. And to see hurting people, you know what you have to do? You have to see people. You see, for you to know when someone's hurting, you have to know what they're like when they're normal. You have to know their mannerisms. You have to know the way they talk. You have to know their actions. You have to know the way they carry themselves. You have to know the way they walk, the way they interact, so that when something changes and all of a sudden they're hurting, you notice these things and then you help. But you got to see people. We can be so caught up in our busy lives that we don't see people anymore. We can be so caught up in our rules and the way things have to be that we don't see people who are hurting. And what Jesus sees is the hurting man, and he heals them. And I wonder how many of us have eyes to see people who are hurting, even when it messes up our routines and our rules. Thirdly, the rule was broken. We've seen hungry, we've seen hurting, but also when someone was in need. In Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, we see one more encounter with Jesus. He entered again into the synagogue where people would go to worship and learn about God. There was a man there whose hand was withered. Watch this. They were watching Jesus. This is the Pharisees, the rule followers. They were watching Jesus to see if he would heal on the Sabbath, so they might accuse him. They didn't care about the man. And Jesus said to the man with the withered hand, "Get up and come forward." And Jesus said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill?" And they kept silent. And I want to highlight this. And looking around at them with anger, Jesus got mad. Grieved at their hardness of heart, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched out, and it stretched it out, and his hand was restored. We find a man who had gone to worship and to work to learn of God. His hand was withered, which prevented him, it hindered his ability to make a living for his family. And all the rule followers were looking around going, "I wonder if Jesus is going to help that dude today." And Jesus said, "Is it okay for me to heal the hand so the man can make a living and go about his daily life?" And they said nothing, because they're more worried about the rule than the man. And Jesus is angered at this point, and he heals the man. And I wonder, in our hearts, do we have routines and rules and rhythms of life that we miss people in need? Because there's people in the church that have needs. I was privileged Friday and Saturday to spend a little bit of time, more time than they intended, but a little bit of time with some individuals in our church that are volunteering to help meet needs around Thompson. We talked about this a while back, a couple of years ago. It was part of my schoolwork, part of my doctoral project, to help facilitate more care among our church through Sunday school. I got really behind in some of my schoolwork, and so it kind of dragged on longer than I intended. But I met with a volunteer from each Sunday school class Friday night and Saturday morning, and we did some training on meeting needs. We're going to give them the title of a care coordinator, and y'all may talk about that this morning, maybe not, but the pastors are going to keep doing everything we've been doing. We're going to keep doing the same things we've been doing, but they're going to help be eyes and ears to see people in need, to see people hurting, to help make sure we're providing care at Thompson through our Sunday school ministry, to make sure we're letting our pastors know when there's things that we can help and serve with. There was a day and time where there were 70 to 80 of us. Last month we averaged close to 220. Our membership is close to 400, and so improving ways to help make sure everyone feels cared for and their needs met. The pastors are going to keep doing what they've been doing, but this is to help in addition. But you know what? We've never done it that way before. And I got a deacon that jokingly tells me that that's a very dangerous thing, Jim, in a Baptist church. We've never done it that way before, right? But the goal, the heart is, how do we more efficiently and effectively make sure that people are cared for? Because that's the point. Because some of you are still bothered that Jesus is quote unquote breaking rules, but he's not breaking the law. And I want to show that to you. Jesus proves himself that he's not breaking the law, but he's doing things that may not have been done that way before. And in Matthew chapter 22, verse 37, someone comes up to Jesus and they ask him a pointed question. And they say, what is the greatest commandment? And he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. And you know that. And then he goes further. He said, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. You know that part. Don't miss this. Verse 40. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. And that explains 1 Samuel 21, and it explains why Jesus heals on the Sabbath, and it explains why Jesus lets his disciples eat on the Sabbath. He says this, the point of the law is to love God with all your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself. You get those two things right, you got the law right. The rules are to help you do those things. The rules are to help you love the Lord your God with all your heart, and the rules are to help you to love your neighbor as yourself. But in the few unique situations where the rule hinders you from loving your neighbor as yourself, you love your neighbor as yourself. The principle, the heart of the law is more important than just following the rules. And if we're honest, there's some of us that get caught up in following rules and we miss the heart of the scriptures. The heart of this entire book, from Genesis to Revelation, the heart of this book is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. It's in the Old Testament, and Jesus quotes it in the New Testament. And secondly, to love your neighbor as yourself, and that's actually in the Old Testament, and it's in the New Testament. That's the heart of the entire scriptures. And everything in the middle is to help us do those things. And I wonder if there's some of us that have gotten so caught up in our rhythms and routines of life that if we were Ahimelech and David showed up hungry, we'd say, dude, you got to go away hungry. I ain't got no bread for you. You know, James talked about that in James chapter 1 and James chapter 2. He says, if a man comes to you and says he's hungry and you say, go be filled, be well, and send him out the door, you know what he said about your faith? Doesn't amount to much. He says, faith that says those things has to be followed up with actions that do those things, and you fill the stomach of the hungry. And you help the hurting, and you meet the needs of the needy. And for the church, I just ask us very pointedly, how well do we do these things? I spent Friday night and Saturday morning with a small group of folks discussing and training how we can do these things better, but it's not just about them. Providing care is a church-wide thing. They're going to help us do these things moving forward, but it's a church-wide. How well do you see people in need? How well, when someone walks in the door, do you see a hungry child that needs food, or are we upset that they're doing something they're not supposed to do? I know there's a fine line there, but do we see the hungry? Do we see the hurting? Do we see the needy? Are we following the intent of the scriptures with our hearts? And maybe just maybe you're here today and you haven't trusted in Jesus Christ. Hear me say this. There's a lot of people in this world that don't have a relationship with Jesus because all they see are rule followers, not people of faith. And here's what I want you to tell me. Though some of us get it horribly wrong trying to follow this book, this is not a book about rules. This is a book about a relationship. That's what it is. And in the ways that we mess up and we make it look and sound like just a bunch of rules, I want you to hear there's a God that says the point of the book is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength through faith in Jesus. And secondly, to love your neighbor as yourself. And if you have kept God at a distance because someone falsely presented this as simply a set of rules, I want you to hear there's a God that loves you. There's a God that wants to save you. He wants to redeem you, and he wants a relationship because he loves you, not because he wants you just to follow a bunch of rules. I don't know where this hits you this morning, but I'm so grateful in my own life that God reminds me of these things. I'm grateful he reminds the church of these things. Maybe you're here this morning and you've gotten so caught up in your routines and rhythm and rules of life that you're missing seeing people. Would you just confess that and say, God, give me eyes to see people like you see them? Maybe you're here this morning. Maybe you're going to join us and see this online later today, and you've kept God at a distance because you think it's all about the rules. It's not about the rules. It's about the relationship. Come to Christ, confessing and repenting of sins. Meet a God who's about love and relationship and you loving other people, and not just simply about a bunch of rules. Let's pray together. But God, we come before you, and I thank you so much that you're not a God of rules. You're a God of relationship. You know, the rules would say it wouldn't make a lot of sense for a father to give up a righteous son for a fallen people. That's not logical, but yet you did it. You went against the grain. You did what probably none of us would do. You laid down your perfect son for a people who were not, because you wanted a relationship. And God, forgive us when we stand behind the pulpits and we sit in our Sunday school classes and we meet around the table and discuss your word and we sound like a bunch of rule followers. There's a place for rules and there's a place for regulations, but the heart of the scripture is about relationship. Forgive us when we present that horribly wrong. For the church, Father, help us to see people who are in need, who are hurting, who are hungry, and help us to meet their needs, whether that be a Monday or a Sunday. Help us to meet their needs. And then I pray, Father, for those that don't know you as Savior and Lord, that have misunderstood the gospel as simply a set of rules, help them to begin to see it's about a God of relationship. And may they meet you and learn about you through faith in Christ this morning. In Christ's name.